Are you feeling the 90s nostalgia? Do you miss going to your local video store? Do you miss hearing about what the actors on 90210 were up to? Well, let's talk about two new documentaries on streaming services, Netflix's The Last Blockbuster and Kid 90 on Hulu. Hey everybody, Dan here. This is Dan Reviews It. Welcome to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. Thank you for finding my video. Please consider subscribing down below, hitting that little bell as well to get all of my new updates on videos. We're going to talk today about two recent streaming movies that cover the 90s. I grew up in it. You know, I'm a 90s kid for sure, graduated high school in 95, so right in the middle of things there. Netflix is The Last Blockbuster and Kid 90 over on Hulu. Now, I will say The Last Blockbuster actually is a 2020 movie. It came out a few months ago on demand, but it just reached Netflix last week, and so it's been firmly planted in Netflix's top 10, so now is the time to talk about this movie. And then Kid 90 over on Hulu just went up, and that is directed by Soleil Moon Frye, Punky Brewster herself. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but first let's talk about The Last Blockbuster. So this is a movie directed by Taylor Morden, and it's all about video chains, specifically Blockbuster, but it does delve into a little bit at the beginning of the rise of the family video store and how sort of Blockbuster put them out of business, and then the Blockbuster business model, and that kind of thing. So it takes a long look at a lot of that video store history, specifically with Blockbuster, but also with your mom and pops as well. But the focal point of this movie is the actual Last Blockbuster video store still in business. It is owned by Dish. And they allow them to use the Blockbuster name and the logo and all of these things. But it's in Bend, Oregon. They had a couple in Alaska up until 2018 is what the movie said. But there's now just this last one, and not only the last one in the U.S., but the last one worldwide. And I've seen stories about this family and this store in the past, because when it did become the very last Blockbuster, obviously a lot of news outlets were talking about it, and they cover that in this movie, that they've done like 500 different interviews between television, radio, and TV shows. So, they were on Ellen, and there's been a huge sort of wave surrounding this store and like, don't let it die, don't let it end and stuff. But a lot of this movie really covers what it meant to be a youth in the 90s and go pick out videos with your family. And some of the interviewees include people that worked for Blockbuster at some point, including Sam Levine from Freaks and Geeks, Kevin Smith. I don't know if he actually worked at a video store, but of course they had that video store portion in Clerks, so he at least had access to one, I guess. And Paul Scheer, he worked at a Blockbuster, and a lot of these sort of, talking head comedians that we used to see on VH1 a lot. Actually, Doug Benson was on there, and Ron Funches. And so it's sort of part a trip down nostalgia lane to, what it was to experience the video store, which I know very well. If you don't know, I worked at Hollywood Video for the last 2 years it was in business, 2006 to 2008. I worked at two different stores locally here. When the first one closed, I went to the other one, and then they closed like 6 months later. So I do have a lot of nostalgia for the video store. I loved working there. It was one of my favorite jobs. I do love working at the movie theater, too. That's definitely up there as well. But they're both sort of hand in hand since it's movie related. But it was just great to, talk to people coming through on the weekend. Oh, what are you watching this weekend, whatever. And you had your regulars and stuff. So, look, I get that. I get the nostalgia for it. It's awesome. It was great to see some of that stuff. However, this movie really recycles a lot of the themes of the talking heads are just kind of saying the same things, like, oh, it was so great. Oh, basically everything I just said, imagine that for, half hour. And then they focused a bit on the family as well. And maybe more than a bit. I shouldn't say that. Actually, quite a bit. The family, we get to meet them, we get to love them. They're so sweet, and the woman has been running it for a couple of decades, and she's, the whole town, every kid that's grown up in that town worked at that Blockbuster. It seems like her whole family's worked there, for decades. And it started out as a family business that Blockbuster ended up, basically buying out. They were like, look, either we're going to open a Blockbuster a block away, or we can turn you into a Blockbuster, whatever. So they sort of started as a family video store. But the most interesting stuff for me was for sure meeting this family and seeing how they run things now. And it was great to sort of take a look at the shelves at the Blockbuster now and to see current movies on there, Us, 5 Feet Apart, movies that have been out the last couple of years. So that was great. And then it was great to sort of hear the demise of Blockbuster, the rise first, and then the demise of Blockbuster. And they really went into how, like, it wasn't even really all Netflix that put them out of business, like a lot of people think. They sort of talked about the different avenues of what really happened. And so those two parts were very, very interesting. But what I didn't like was just the continual talking heads. It was just like watching a VH1, when they used to do I Love the 80s. It was like VH1 put together something called I Love the Blockbuster. And, it was just all the same people saying the same things, basically. And Doug Benson, I don't know if he ever worked at one or, he has his podcast, Doug Loves Movies, so he just loves talking about movies. But there was like 6 or 7 minutes devoted to him visiting this Last Blockbuster in Oregon and walking around and, texting his buddy Kumail Nanjiani when he saw the Big Sick on the shelf. It's like, that to me was just sort of not stupid, but I just, it didn't interest me. Like, I would rather hear more about the family and what they've done and everything. And I liked hearing about the history of Blockbuster. So this is a real mixed bag for me. I think for video store enthusiasts, people that have a very fond memory for going to the video store, which really is everybody that's probably between the ages of 30 and 55, or 60. I mean, we grew up in that era. My buddies that are about a decade younger than me, they were sort of on the end of that. But yeah, I remember going to all the local video stores near me. We had an Errol's, which I think was just local. Then we had a West Coast Video. We had a Movies Unlimited, which was also local. And then eventually we did get a Blockbuster in the town. But anyway, so for me, it was cool to sort of go over that nostalgia. But the talking heads were almost irrelevant. Like Jamie Kennedy saying how, I mean, he was at least a little interesting because he used to do advertising for Blockbuster. He was in the ad campaign. So I guess that was a little interesting. But then he didn't really say much about it, I like Jamie Kennedy, but he just didn't give us too much information there. So I don't know. This one was a real mixed bag for me. I think it's worth seeing for nostalgia purposes, but I really wish it had more of a focus. I leave The Last Blockbuster with a C+. Let's move on now to Kid 90. This is directed by Soleil Moon Frye and largely based on her old videotape. She carried a video camera around with her everywhere in the 90s. So she recorded a lot of stuff with her and, her acting friends, Stephen Dorff, David Arquette, Jenny Lewis, Sarah Gilbert from Roseanne, Brian Austin Green from 90210. So a lot of that stuff. And so they found a lot of those people as well. Well, they didn't have to, find them. They're still working actors, but they got them to do interviews now, sort of looking back at some of that stuff. And so in that respect, it's very interesting. Soleil Moon Frye is, back in the spotlight now because of the Punky Brewster reboot. But of course, she got her start as young Punky in the 80s, and she's a year older than me. So like I basically grew up with her. But in the 90s, she wasn't really getting a lot of acting gigs. So I thought she kind of just disappeared. I didn't know if she just went to college or whatever. But no, she was still in and around Hollywood doing the occasional like B horror movie. But for the most part, being a kid and hanging out with celebrities and people that she had grown up with, like Mark Paul Gosselaar, that they are now teenagers and hanging out. And so it was interesting to see, a lot of that footage from the old days, but also to hear the actors today talking about what it meant to be a kid star that maybe didn't go too off the rails. I mean, like Mark Paul Gosselaar, Brian Austin Green, Soleil Moon Frye herself. I mean, these guys didn't have, real crazy, jail stories and, oh, we got busted with drugs, but boy, were there a lot of drugs, and we saw them in this movie, So Moon Frye put away these videos and her diaries for 20 years and didn't even look at them. And now, recently she opened up the vault and was looking at all this stuff. And it's very interesting to have her perspective 20, 25 years on at what some of the things that were going on, because one of her dear friends, somebody that she, was dating for a while, Jonathan Brandis, killed himself maybe 16, 17 years ago. And so she was looking back at that footage and being like, oh my God, there were all these signs. I didn't see them. Da, 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 da. She also goes into detail about a romantic relationship she had with Charlie Sheen and losing her virginity to Charlie Sheen when she was 18. And so there's a lot of interesting facts in this movie, but it's not like a bombshell movie. I don't think she's really trying to throw anybody under the bus here. But yes, there's people doing shrooms, and there's people at parties that were, way underage and stuff. We see Leonardo DiCaprio at probably 14 or 15. Mark Wahlberg, same thing. And obviously these people had to, I guess, sign off, on having this in the movie, or maybe not because it's a documentary. I don't know how that works, but either way, we see a lot of people doing a lot of questionable things that, now 20, 25 years later, we're like, well, who cares about that? But if we knew at the time Mark Wahlberg was doing shrooms or whatever, that would have been a huge deal, So it's really interesting that these guys and gals all trusted that Frye would, keep these videos for herself and not sell them to the Inquirer or whatever. She was not really much of a working actress at the time. She could have made a quick buck off of that, and she never did. And people, really appreciated that. And you could tell that she's still friends with a lot of these people, when they do the interview segments. But it's interesting to see her look back on that time in a completely different reflection now than she was in the mindset of back then. And she talks about a sexual assault that happened as well. She doesn't name names there, but, that's very, she's really opening up about that. The big issue with the movie, though, is that it just doesn't delve into anything that's that groundbreaking in terms of the experience on the whole of being a child actor, growing up in the spotlight as well, with your Hollywood buddies. Like it talks about specific moments, like, oh yeah, we tripped on shrooms that one time, or yeah, that party was great. And she does talk about how her developing so quickly and having very big breasts at a young age, got her sort of not blacklisted, but she wasn't given roles because everybody was like, well, we're used to seeing you being so little, and Punky Brewster was, this cute little kid, and now you're big old busty Soleil Moon Frye, and we don't know what to do with you. So, that part was interesting, but we don't delve nearly enough into those kind of topics. It's mostly like, let's look at this party and talk about, how that was or whatever. And to me, at a scant 71 minutes, we could have really dove in to some of those other topics and expanded upon it rather than just having David Arquette sitting there and being like, oh, yeah, that was a good time. I think there's some interesting revelations here, and it's really cool that she had all this footage, that she hung on to all this footage. And I should point out, Leonardo DiCaprio is one of the executive producers. So he wasn't interviewed for this, but we do see a little bit of young Leo footage. And, he's doing party stuff that maybe he shouldn't have been doing at 14 or 15. But obviously at this point in his life, he's like, well, that was when I was a kid, da-da-da-da-da. Everybody's got that stuff in their past. So, that's kind of cool, too, that he signed on for this. But I just don't think they delve in nearly enough to some of this stuff that were presented. And it's interesting that of all the footage that she must have had, hours and hours and hours, I'm sure, if she had a camera with her at all times, that she really focused mostly on the party aspect of it for a large portion of the movie. And I really wish she dedicated more of the film to discussing more personal issues about the spotlight and that sort of thing. And especially, it was nice when she was, talking about when she moved to New York to go to the actor's studio and sort of, fell in with the skater crowd. Like, that was really interesting and cool, but it's only for a few minutes, that are dedicated to that part. So I just wanted more, is basically my big problem with it. Certainly an interesting watch, but way too short. We need to dive into these topics. So I give Kid 90 a B minus. So look, for 90s nostalgia, you could certainly do worse. I watched them back to back. I was sort of in the zone with the 90s, so I would recommend doing that if you have both Netflix and Hulu. But yeah, I wanted more from Kid 90, and I wanted maybe different from the Last Blockbuster, delving into some different topics there. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you back here next time. Bye.